Okay, so last night, or yesterday afternoon, when I was preparing for last night's teachings, and I was hoping to start talking about equanimity last night. I didn't get to it, so I'll do it next Thursday. But just as at that time, then I got an email that Zopa kindly forwarded it to me, and it's all about equanimity. And it's really very, very touching. So I thought I would read it to you, not just summarize it, but put it in this man's own words, okay? So he wrote, Dear Venerable Children, I thought it would be nice to share a story with you, a nice story. In 1968 and 69, I was in Vietnam attached to the 5th Special Forces Division as a member of the 199th Light Infantry Brigade. We pulled operations in the south, rice paddies, and in the jungles. Our job was to search and destroy the enemy. I was very good at what I did. One particular day, as we were walking silently down a path in heavy jungle, a North Vietnamese army soldier suddenly appeared in front of us waving a white flag. As we approached him, we could see he was an officer in the North Vietnamese army, and obviously he wanted to give himself up. We called such soldiers chu hoi, and they would often come over to our side and aid us in finding the enemy and weaponry stashes. We learned also much about the enemy movements through chu hois. I remember thinking at that time how young he was to be a colonel in the North Vietnamese army. We were told, especially me, since I was a squad leader, not to talk to him or have any communication with him. After all, he was the enemy. One day, perhaps a week later, we were at base camp, and I was sitting on a bunker just keeping an eye out. I looked in the middle of the camp, and there, sitting on a log all by himself, was this North Vietnamese army officer. I watched him just sitting with his hands together in prayer and his eyes closed. After a while, he dropped his hands and hung his head down. I remember all this because at the time I felt this overwhelming sadness for him. It is hard to explain, but the longer I watched him, the sorrier for him I got, until literally I had tears in my eyes. Then I broke the rule. I walked over to him and nodded a greeting. I was answered with the most perfect English you can imagine, which really surprised me. He invited me to sit next to him, which I did, and we began to talk. I learned that he was a college professor from Hanoi, had been educated in England, and was missing his beautiful wife and children back in Hanoi. He showed me a book of poetry that he had written, and in which he had drawn beautiful pictures of dragons and lotus flowers. He read me some of his poetry, and it was truly wonderful. He got out pictures of his wife and children, and I did the same with my family. I spent perhaps a half an hour with him, and before I knew it, we were no longer enemies, but were instead friends. Brothers, actually. He was a great guy, and we both shared the same reality, that neither one of us wanted to be where we were. He needed to be home with his family teaching at the university, and I needed to be out of that war. But the wonderful lesson for me was that if we just sit down and open our hearts to each other, then we are no longer strangers. We are brothers. I do not know what happened to him later. He was picked up by helicopter and taken away. I missed him a lot. I imagine that when the North Vietnamese invaded the South, he was not looked upon too kindly. I prayed that he made it home okay. But at least for that one brief moment, we shared a wonderful time together, and because of that, we were able to put the war out of our minds and to discover compassion. It is easy to love when we clear our minds and hearts and allow love to enter. Isn't that beautiful? So, you know, when you least expect it, in a situation where you least expect it, a war situation, then suddenly, you know, being able to open your heart and see the common humanity. And even more than common humanity, just the similarities amongst people. And in that way, really see that making people enemies in a war or in any other situation is really a very artificial, human-created obstacle, isn't it? You know, these are just human-created categories that, you know, friend, enemy, and stranger, that we put people in due to our own afflictions, due to our own self-centered mind that evaluates everybody based on how they relate to me. But it's so completely artificial, so completely ridiculous, and very superficial because it doesn't see what's below the commonality in everybody's heart. So I thought that story was so touching, you know, and really spot on as an example, not only of the uselessness of friends, enemies, and strangers, but as an example of how to really open our hearts and have love and compassion for people. Okay.